name is Julio Davila. I'm delighted to see you all here, and I'm delighted especially to see the colleagues from IIHS. We've got a very long collaboration going on over a decade now. We just had 3 hours of a wonderful, maybe a love-in in a way, but a sort of a reflection from Aro and Neha on 10 years of this collaboration, but more importantly, 10 years of their fabulous work in India. Initially in Delhi, then they moved to Bangalore, and a lot of you know about their work because that's why you're here. And this is given a concrete form in this fabulous book. It's a book which puts us to shame. I mean, I was saying earlier that it shows the systematic nature of Aro and how his mind works, but others that they've got full yeah, but you influenced it. There's no doubt about it. There's full sort of statistics on the applicants and the people who've been shortlisted, and find the people who stayed in the course. All sorts of statistics that I wish we had in Bartlett and UCL, and it shows the seriousness with which they've taken this fabulous endeavor. I'm not going to say much because they're the ones that have to be protagonists in this, but thank you, Aro, and thank you, Neha, for coming all the way and giving us the privilege of launching this here in London, because you've done one in the US, so you've come back across the Atlantic, or from India rather, to do it with us, and it's excellent. The way it's going to work is, I think, Aro, you starting?
Yeah, I'll start quickly and then hand over to Neha.
Okay, so Aro will start. Neha will talk about 15 minutes or so. Barbara and Caren will then respond. Barbara Lipietz, where are you?
Yeah.
And Caren Levy, who's here, will respond, and then we open to questions from the floor. Caren is professor at UCL and a former director of DPU. I had the privilege of actually taking over the DPU as a director for 8 years. Then Michael was sitting at the back, is the current director. And Barbara is the Vice Dean for International Development. Vice Dean International. Of course, I have to have development in it. It's my bias. It's all about development, isn't it? So anyway, so wonderful to have you here, Barbara, as well. But she's also based at DPU. Anyway, so without further ado, Neha, do you need a hand with this, or you can just click on that? Okay, brilliant. You've got to use from there, no? Yeah.
Okay, so thanks, folks. It's really nice to be here. This is kind of a closure. It is one round of closure of a process that started a decade ago, a little bit longer than a decade ago, actually, when IIHS came to colleagues in different parts of the world and basically said, we're trying to develop and build this heterodox institution. And to do that, you have to have a curriculum framework that actually embraces the kind of challenges that we have. And UCL and a whole range of partners from the UK and across the world were brought together by Caren and the team from the DPU to actually help us sort of build out this program. So I'm going to speak about the stuff that we're working on this book here. The book, of course, is Towards a New Urban Practice. It documents some of the interesting sort of processes and challenges that we had, but the core issue here, of course, the core mission of IIHS is really enabling India's urban transformation. And in some senses, this is the first proof of concept that you can set up an educational program that's based on practice, on transformational ideas, and actually sort of deliver it over time. So there were 3 broad questions that we were trying to answer. The first question, in a sense, kicked off the entire debate on the curriculum framework, and that was a very simple question, but it's, even though it's simple, it took us almost 2.5-3 years to answer, and that is, what does a young urban practitioner or researcher need to know to help transform India in 2030? This was asked in 2010. It took us 2 years and 200 people from across the world to kind of try to answer this question. Half of them were from India, and the other half were from pretty much all major geographies. But the interesting thing is, in that conversation were not only academics, but policymakers and practitioners, because the question for us was, how do you actually influence and change things on the ground and in practice? And that's why that debate and that dialogue was quite very important. So MIT anchored, the North American geography. We had Arop, which is not so far from us here in Fitzrovia, actually working with us on the practice side. And we had colleagues from Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and of course a number of us actually thinking on that. So basically from this emerged the Masters of Urban Practice program, which is documented in a whole range of other books, etc. Unfortunately, for a whole range of interesting and not so interesting reasons, we were not able to implement the 2-year master's program, which is the first interdisciplinary program of that kind, pretty much certainly in our geography, but in many other geographies. So what we've done instead is run what we call the Urban Fellows program, which is an abbreviated version of the Master of Urban Practice. So the Master of Urban Practice, in a sense, in its framing, from the curricular point of view, does two things. It brings in people from 11 clusters of disciplines. It would bring them in to look at how the disciplines talk to each other in the first year. In the second year, people concentrate in connecting those 2 years together. Pedagogically is a very strong influence on practice and the practica, and of course something that we call our core curriculum, which is really about experiential learning. But operationally, and what this book does touch on is, as we try and address these questions, is the core question of how faculty can be built to deliver this question. Because you have a lot of interesting ideas, but if you don't have faculty in the room, if you don't have faculty that has the ability to co-create and build these kind of processes, it's very easy to fall back on both disciplinary or kind of narrow ways of doing this kind of stuff. And then of course the larger question we spent the seminar this afternoon trying to address is, what kind of institutional form and structure can enable this? We have the advantage of starting a greenfield institution, and hence we were not bound in some senses by the kind of rules that would normally you'd struggle with in a either a Baroque university or a new generation university as far as that's concerned. So these were the core sets of questions, and we'll try and sort of look at them more critically as we look at self out. But what is the evidence that we have at the moment? One of the big challenges we had in 2010, 11, 12 was that nobody really knew how to design and execute an interdisciplinary program of the scale and scope. There were many sets of institutions across the world, including the DPU and the team at the Bartlett and other places, who were doing this in limited contexts. But we were really trying to build something that's built on knowledges that are relevant to the Indian condition. There were very interesting challenges there, and that is that much of the knowledges that we have were either relating to other places. So we had curricula that came from across the world. I have an old colleague and batchmate of mine from IIT sitting here, who's a professor. We were taught, Kapil Gupta, we were taught about stuff that could have been taught at MIT, whether you have the credits coming from there or here, there's no difference. But obviously the Indian urbanization story is quite different. So we had stuff that was coming from somewhere else or from another time, from imaginations of the 1950s and 60s when things like Chandigarh were being built. And of course the world by the 2000s had changed quite dramatically. So in a sense, the challenge was to create a set of new knowledges, create a system to create those new knowledges, and build those knowledges and critical theory based on practice. So I think the good news is, at least over the last decade or so, we managed to set up a system to do that. We're not teaching a very large class by Indian standards. He was just talking about the fact that the intake in the IIT is 1,100 people every year. Fine, we're just doing 60, which is not so small for a UK class, but compared to what India needs to do, it's actually quite small. So what's the evidence that supports this stuff? So we've got a whole set of folks that are out. There are a few hundred of them. This year we'll touch 300 or so. But the more interesting thing is this graph that Julio was just talking about. This is the sort of the evidence in some senses. At the bottom you have a legend that starts with the 11 clusters of disciplines: architecture, urban design, urban planning, obviously seen as urban areas, social sciences, economics, political science and public policy, humanities, media, arts and design, journalism, law, technology, commerce and management. Commerce is particularly Indian and maybe UK thing. And then sciences, natural sciences and environmental sciences. So we designed this program to draw people in from all of these disciplines. The question then is, if you have specialists or people at least who've done their undergraduate degree in these programs, some of them actually have a master's degree, how do you help blend them together and bring them into a program? So the question that we were asking, and in a sense, the response that we were getting from different parts of the world was, this is this is something that can't be done. We've actually done it. It was a big and significant challenge. This is updated, Julio. The graph that you have goes to 2023. This is the current class that we have here. So you can see it's quite diverse. The sort of urban disciplines are probably something like a quarter or a third of the whole set. But bringing in people from multiple disciplines is very important, because the fundamental principle, apart from interdisciplinary engagement, is peer learning. So we consciously curate the class so you have a diverse class, so that people inside the teaching learning environment will actually help teach each other. That's very critical. And then, because we team teach and we do a significant amount of engagement inside in a fairly heterogeneous classroom environment, they get to see and experience the contests, both ontological and also epistemological, between the disciplines in the classroom. So it's obviously a very intense process, and that's our big challenge at the moment, is how you double the class size, how you increase it over much. So that's one set of evidences in some senses. You can bring in a diverse class. These folks get out, they get pretty good jobs, they start doing interesting things. They're not ready to change the world as yet, they're pretty young still. It'll take a while for them to get that far. And they also get into good research programs, which I'll show you a little bit later. So where they're coming from? This is an important thing for us. We are building a national institution, so it's very important for us, and we work very hard, and we don't have the advantage of India's elite institutions like the IITs and the IIMs, where people come through, 200,000, 300,000 people apply for the programs, and then you get a few hundred that come inside, or 1,000 that come inside here. We have to go out and make sure that we have people from most geographies. So you can see here, this is where they've come from in the last 7 or 8 years, pretty much from most geographies in the country. I think there's something like 26 states that are there. But the most important thing is we're drawing people in from small places. This is very important to our theory of change, because the effective thing is people need to go back and change places where they come from. Obviously there's a pull to go to metropolitan India and then to go to other metropolitan areas that's there. But this is the evidence of where people actually come from. So it is pretty diverse. Our class at the moment, this year's class, at least more than half of them come from small towns in the country. And that changes the nature of teaching, that changes the nature of the learning experience, and it actually enables us to do things that we could not have done as a faculty on our own. And then what we do is, literally in the second day that people come in, we sort of embed them, or we kind of, in some cases, maybe drown them in the city. So for us, the classroom is not a place like this, it's the entire cityscape that's there. So people go out and you can see this is the kind of evidence for that. We have a whole range of practical sites over the last, this is of course obviously because we teach and learn in Bangalore. We use the city as a site to engage and understand things, and you can see here, these are our two campuses, the city campus where some of you may have visited, and then the new one that we're building on the periphery of the city. So we're working across the urban landscape. Obviously this is the site of our significant research, so it becomes kind of easy. And then in the second term, they go out and they do projects and internships. Projects within IIHS, because we do a lot of practice-based work and policy work, etc. Plus, with a whole range of institutions, we work with a large number of institutions inside the country. This is where they go out in their second term to try and engage with and try and get a sense of how the practices that they're involved in will actually play itself out. But the most interesting outcome, in some senses, is this: we didn't know this was possible, and that is the same 11 clusters of disciplines in that sense. So this is a mapping of, it's a sample, it's not the full set, of where people came in from and where they went into forms of practice. And you can see that they are very diverse, starting with academic and research institutions, higher education, development organizations, government, politics. We have a couple of folks that are in politics, that's why it's a very thin line that's there, into consulting, into professional services, and into think tanks. So this, I think, is the most important thing that we have evidence of, that people can come from a whole range of disciplines. The city itself is a system of systems. We're trying to educate and train the system integrators, not the specialists. We're not training the architects, the engineers, the lawyers, the health specialists, etc., that help run the city. We're trying to educate the people who are trying to build this all together. And I would say we have a fairly decent sense that this actually works. So we do a fair amount of work now actually charting the trajectory of these 250, now 300 people who come out and try and understand how that actually works, because in a sense this is a mapping of how knowledge engages with the spaces of practice, and the spaces of practice are continuously changing. So this, in a sense, gives you the trajectory of how changes actually take place. And I think with colleagues at the DPU, etc., we've had the privilege of trying to use this method in other geographies in the world, in Africa, in Latin America, and that's been a tremendous sort of education and interest as far as they're concerned. So basically, you can go from this to that. This is kind of, it doesn't fit very easily within the disciplinary frame of conventional universities, which are there to achieve a different mission in some senses. And then, they go to lots of places in the country, probably not as many places as they come from. So you can see, in larger cities actually drawing off these people, so in different places, because that's where, let's say, employment opportunities are, and our end value is relatively small in some senses, but they are pretty much across the country. So about 85% of them go to work in a whole range of different types of organizations that I showed you just now, and about 15% of them actually go out for their PhDs, and some of them for their master's program, because some of them are relatively young. So in a sense, this is to us because we are not giving a master's degree here, fine. We're just giving a certificate. But our certificate, because of the quality of the work and the people that we have, is kind of seen with equivalence in some interesting places pretty much across the world. So if you look at this stack up from the UK, from the US, etc., and of course in Europe, and we have a couple of people, I guess, in Australia and Japan, etc. So in a sense, I would say proof of concept that the system is actually creating people who are going out, and I guess our first PhDs will be out in the next couple of years or so, who are actually going out to build faculty who can think and work in different places, because unless you're able to transform and infect the higher education system, the impact of the larger process is going to be constrained and limited in some senses. So that's just the evidence of the fact that, by and large, this kind of thing does work a little bit. It's still a very small scale program. We hopefully will take it to 5 to 10 times its size in the next few years, inshallah, given the government of India's interest in this kind of stuff that's there. And Neha will take you into the more detailed sort of specifics of the program and how it actually runs, which is the primary content of the book.
Thanks, Aro. So like Aro said, the focus of our book and the focus of our work through the UFP tries to address 6 key sort of foundational goals. The first, like he said, is to educate a new generation of practitioners and researchers who are able to work across interdisciplinary, complex and heterogeneous areas, to bridge the gap between theory and practice, which you'll see when we talk about the way in which our curriculum operates, to build an inclusive institution, and I'll talk a little bit about how we curate our class itself, as well as building an interdisciplinary faculty, to be able to use contextual knowledge, practice and experience. So our curriculum is very much grounded in the context of India, South Asia and the Global South more broadly, and to build a learner-centric environment that relies incredibly heavily on peer learning, and then to bring all of that back to the context of the South and India particularly. And so what does the book do? The book curates and takes you through our journey over the last 6 years of teaching and actually transacting one version of the IIHS Master's curriculum. We encourage you to read the book both as an archive but also as a collective reflection. And so, what Aro and I are doing is speaking for a larger community of our faculty who have all of us together written this book. And so for, a 10-something years old institution in the Global South, what this is sort of highlighting the different forms of urban knowledge that we wanted to build, about how we can think about an interdisciplinary, about interdisciplinarity that's located and grounded in the context of the South, which is teaching from the South, but not only for the South. Looking at sort of a different way of thinking about pedagogy, how does that tie into institutional and operational design and the lives of our alumni, which brings it all together. And I think part of the sort of the core that we'd like everyone to leave with is to understand that it is not just the curriculum or the content of what we teach that is important, but all of these different aspects come together to be able to enable us to deliver a program of this sort, which is truly kind of transformational in what it enables our learners to do. And so we'll be focusing on 3 kind of snapshots across our talk today, which is looking at the admissions process and the faculty composition, looking at the curriculum itself, and then closing with just bringing back to the trajectories of our alumni that Aro mentioned briefly before. So the challenge for us is to ensure, like Aro said, a class that has both disciplinary diversity, but also also socioeconomic diversity. Not only because the formative action and sort of diversity across multiple vectors is the right thing to do, but also that for us, our pedagogy just will not work without it. And because we rely so heavily on peer learning, a diverse classroom, both in terms of discipline but also life experiences, is critical for us to be able to enable our learners to be able to go out and confront several of these challenges and problems that they will face as urban practitioners when they get there. And so the conventional process in most Indian public universities is to rely on a quota system that allows for and accounts for one particular dimension of vulnerability, which is typically caste. And in our case, we've come up with a more kind of multi-dimensional diversity point system, which allows us to look at sort of multiple dimensions of vulnerability and marginalization within within our student body. And so it allows us to bring together differences on the basis of gender, of course, of various aspects of socioeconomic identity that include caste but go beyond, which also looks at sort of access to education, looks at family income status, look at metropolitan versus non-metropolitan status, for example. And this allows us to put together also a public record of what our sort of the diversity in our classrooms really is. So if you look at these first graphs, what you see is that the number of first generation learners in our program has grown systematically over the last 6 to 7 years. And so we now have close to 50% of our students whose either at least one parent has not been to school. And in a lot of cases, often both. The second set of graphs shows you, and the bottom is, you've already seen this, so the bottom is disciplinary diversity. The top one is talking about the numbers of sort of our caste composition in the classroom. And this has been something that has been needing constant adjustment as we work through the process. For example, we found early on that we weren't actually reflecting the true number, the proportion of, the caste differences in the proportion of the application pool wasn't necessarily always being reflected in the final class. And we tweaked our admissions process to enable that to improve. And so we found over time that we need to constantly go back to the drawing board to our admissions process to ensure that diversity remains constant. So it's not a one-time fixed solution, it's something that needs constant work. You've already seen this, but they come from all across the country, and that again adds to the diversity of learning experiences in the classroom, because while faculty themselves may not have the breadth of experiences, the life worlds that our learners come from allows them to learn from each other and face very different urban contexts as they sort of work through the class together. The second important thing for us is that our faculty needs to be as diverse in terms of both discipline but also sort of various socioeconomic characteristics as well. And we found that as the diversity in our faculty has increased, so has the diversity in our student population. And so most faculty at IIHS come from at least 2 disciplinary backgrounds, and we curate very carefully for this. Several have at least 3 and sometimes even 4 different disciplinary backgrounds. And this, again, is a reflection of that our faculty come from not just diverse academic backgrounds, but also their practice kind of experiences are very diverse. And these are reflected in the ways in which we're able to offer experiential learning in the classroom itself to our fellows. And as you will see, they're spread across sort of law and regulation, but also social inequality and health, work and livelihoods, a whole set of sort of planning, infrastructure, but also method, as well as looking at sort of environment and sustainability questions. So there's a spectrum across this, and our interdisciplinarity is reflected not only in our academic training, but also in the worlds of practice we inhabit. Just a quick sort of background, the curriculum process, like Aro mentioned, was sort of a broader process that was iterative. It was a 3-year process that brought together partners pretty much across the world. And these were the 3 kind of elements that are core to the IIHS overall curriculum, which looked at creating urban practitioners and, most importantly, system integrators. So we're not looking at creating specialists. And we took these 3 elements of the IIHS curriculum framework and adapted them to create the Urban Fellows program. So the Commons year became the Commons term, the concentration year became the elective term, and then we added an internship term, which would have been sort of the gap between the 2 years across the first and second year of the Masters to create the Urban Fellows program. And what each of these does is when they come into the Commons, they start by building a core vocabulary, a shared vocabulary across the urban that all of them have a collective understanding of. They learn to diagnose, analyze, interconnect things that they're seeing in the field. They get to build core skills through a whole set of methods. Please come in front. And most importantly, learn from place. They move then into the electives, which allows them to build on whatever they've learned in the Commons, and then continue to deepen their analysis, acquire very specific knowledge sets in particular areas, begin to build out their practice, and learn from starting to become propositive and experimental, which then takes them all the way out into their internships. The Commons, which is the first term, and this is something that works across all of IIHS, is that it is collectively taught, so which means that not only do we curate and create the curriculum together, but is also taught by at least 3 to 4 faculty in the classroom together at the same time. And this is incredibly important for us because that allows us to bring disciplinary diversity into the classroom on a daily basis, and it's not just reflecting the curriculum itself, but is practiced. These are taught sequentially. So 2 layers operate at a time and they build on each other. And then we start introducing them to thinking about sort of the southern question from here itself. So for example, when we talk about work and economy, we look at a whole range from looking at informal economies all the way to platformization and digital economies. But even in thinking of that, we reflect, for example, much more on questions of social welfare and how platform workers have access to social welfare programs, for example, rather than looking very much at sort of the Uberization of the economy. And so the ways in which we teach these questions are very much focused on the kind of challenges we face in our cities. The second part of the curriculum focuses a lot on skills and methods, where we kind of walked through a whole set of questions of what kinds of methods do interdisciplinary practitioners need. Do they need to read? How do they learn to write? How do they learn to count? And so we have methods that go all the way from a data skills lab and sort of, GIS and spatial appreciation, which are much more conventional, all the way to looking at how to use media, how to write in and from the city, not just academic writing, but also popular writing, and looking at spatializing urban, so bringing together different layers of skills and data and methods to enable them to be able to draw on the different sources that are available to them. And this is just kind of a snapshot of the lists of the kinds of methods that we offer, both across the Commons term as well as more advanced skill labs and methods in the elective term. And this is sort of where all of it comes together really in some ways, which is the practica. It's the first term. They spend 30% of their time out in the field. They spend most of their time there doing actual kind of practice in the city. They choose sites. It goes beyond just the conventional studio model that most architects or architecture programs have, because it's place-based learning, it's across methods, it's across disciplines. And the key aim of the practica is to actually enable fellows and learners to integrate across all of the 6 commons layers that I showed before. And this is sort of how we start introducing the fellows both to worlds of practice, but also to making experiential learning a really key and core element of the way in which they learn right from the beginning when they come into the classroom, so that they gradually build up to a world of practice by the time they graduate. Just a whole set of examples of different kinds of projects that are practical projects that our fellows have undertaken across the years, which as you can see, is a range of things from informal economies to unions to looking at a whole set of other questions in the city itself. This is the second part of the experiential learning program. As they move into the electives, they start, as they've gone through and are ready to kind of learn a little bit more, begin diving into a more kind of advanced set of skills. They start working with us on live IIHS projects. And so this is sort of a second step to getting them exposed to worlds of practice where they have real clients, they work on research projects with us, they work with the government, they work with sort of private clients and doing a whole set of the kinds of work that we do on live projects, which allows them to work with real deadlines, to understand the constraints of being part of a team of urban professionals. And again, as you can see, it's still graded with under faculty supervision, so it's not kind of throwing them out there immediately, but the kind of levels of independence are kind of starting to build up. And as you see, there are a whole range of projects. So some of it was working on off-grid infrastructures in Bangalore, around public health questions, around law and legislation and management and their implications for the urban. And so just to kind of bring that all together, and what we've kind of learned from the last 6 years of teaching, our first reflections are that it's possible to do, it's absolutely worth doing, but it takes a lot. It's a lot of effort, it is a lot of faculty time, it is a lot of kind of collective working, and it's definitely not easy to do. We found that place-based learning, experiential learning, and integrating sort of the worlds of work into our curriculum itself are absolutely essential. And again, the question of how we're able to mobilize it. I mean, we've been able to do it. One is because we have a small program. We've been able and given the flexibility to experiment and adapt and change and evolve. But it has enabled our learners to leave with a very specific set of integrative skills, to actually be able to become complex problem solvers. But again, not easy to do, requires a lot of effort and a lot of resources. And I think it's important to also understand that the ways in which we think about teaching and making analysis, making sort of pedagogy interdisciplinary is very different from the way in which we move across practice and make that interdisciplinary. And so the ways in which, and that reflects in the ways in which each of our sort of experiential learning components move. So the way in which we teach the practica, the projects, and the internships actually reflects those challenges about how we actually move them from one step to the other to enable them to get to a point where they're actually able to run with their own propositive work. This has been, I think, the biggest challenge that we've had and our biggest challenge remains being able to curate a faculty that is interdisciplinary and is able to work within the constraints of a program like this. And being able to transact a program like this depends on having a faculty that works together in concert and is able to, commit to the level of collective teaching and collective kind of pedagogical approaches that a program like this requires. This for us was a non-negotiable. It was not an easy decision to root learning because we had to create a lot of our teaching material ourselves. So 60 to 70% of what is taught in our classrooms is taught from IIHS research and practice projects. And I think that the decision to root our learning in southern cities, in Indian cities, was not an easy task, and I think we were able to do it partly through serendipity, partly through a very concerted effort, but it is absolutely essential for them to be able to sort of learn and apply their practice from where they come and take it back to where they come. I think as we grow, challenges of expanding it beyond Indian cities to other locations is something that we'll have to start thinking a little bit about as our own research begins to expand as well. And I think this is something that we don't often talk about enough, but methods are critical to interdisciplinarity. A lot of the fights are not necessarily thematic, but are methodological. And if we're not able to get our students and to become practitioners who can bring together methods depending on what the need of the problem on the ground is, we're not going to be able to enable them to become sort of, system integrators in the way they want to. They have to be able to learn to bring together different ways of solving a problem, because just conceptually understanding, and bringing them together alone is not enough. And the thing that we found finally is that we cannot run an interdisciplinary class in the absence of peer learning. It's absolutely critical for us. We would not be able to transact half of what we do if our class wasn't this interdisciplinary and diverse and was not able to sort of carry each other through. In a lot of ways, the work that we do ends up being facilitating a lot of that peer learning. And we've also focused a lot on sort of the entire process around the way in which we curate the program, which is not just the curriculum and not just the students and not just the faculty, but also the teaching and learning spaces, the living spaces, and all of that comes together to be able to enable us to create and curate the kind of class that we have. And at the end, we need to have both not just an interdisciplinary faculty, but also rethink and reevaluate what counts for knowledge. And whose knowledge gets privileged in the classroom, and to not always conflate necessarily academic qualification with the availability and access to knowledge. And so a lot of IIHS faculty have and draw on an incredible wealth of experience through practice to be able to teach in the classroom, and others draw on their academic diversity and disciplines. As far as alumni trajectories go, you saw some of this from Aro, but you can see that there's actually a really nice split across where our fellows go. They go to think tanks, and about 15 to 16% in think tanks, about 15% to professional services, about 22% in private enterprise and consulting. We have about another 15% within government. There's across academic research institutions and higher education who've gone on to study more than another 15 to 20%. And so you can see that it's actually not that they're concentrated in any one particular sector or area in terms of where they go. And so our alumni work and practice across multiple institutional setups. And I think that the important thing for us that we learned was that your incoming discipline did not necessarily determine your outgoing modes of practice. And so we were beginning to see shifts and mobilities in their trajectories as they went through the program, some to a lesser degree than others, but mobilities and shifts were happening and continued to happen even after they graduated. And so that was a sensibility that they took with them. This you've already seen. Aro's sort of showed you a little bit of this snapshot, but this is just a thing again to talk a little, to sort of think through a little bit that the ways in which if folks who come from particular sort of academic disciplines don't necessarily go to specific types of employment work as they graduate. And so we found the social scientists often moving into private enterprise and consulting, whereas we found sort of a lot of the journalists and humanities scholars going into more academic fields as well. And so as we close, this is, I think, the sort of set of challenges for us as we continue to grow. The biggest question for us is sort of this one of scale. How do we preserve diversity as we scale? How does the scale of our geography and where our work is located change as our curriculum changes and scales? How can we bring together and continue to synergize our research, teaching, and practice as we are able to do now? One of the biggest learnings we had from COVID was to think about how technology changed the way in which we can learn. And how can we continue to do that without kind of shutting out certain populations and groups? How do we take learning outside the university and beyond the classroom? Changes in employment markets, and also as we start to think about transacting the masters of urban practice, what lessons can we take and learn from the UFP into the masters? And I think finally, sort of thinking about how do we anticipate new forms of urban practice and as they emerge, how can we as a faculty but also as an institution and a curriculum remain nimble and sort of alive to the fact that it's going to need constant change. All of this set within sort of a very rapid expansion of an urbanizing India. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much.
So, hello everyone. I want to start by saying that it's a great pleasure for me to be part of the book launch. It's a very wonderful book towards a new urban practice. In fact, it was 2009 that the DPU and IIHS established a partnership, and that you first shared your vision for the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, and the kind of learning practices that you wanted to create to respond to the enormous urban challenge faced by India, but I mean always within a global context. I think this was always very clear from the start, this connection between India and the global context. And I want to start by saying that it's been a privilege and an inspiration to be associated with the establishment of IIHS, with the Urban Fellows Program, and with many other fascinating research and practice-based activities that IIHS has launched since 2009. It's also a great joy to see this book, to hold it. It captures the learning from a relatively short but a very dynamic and innovative history, as you've seen from the presentation. And I think that the challenges laid out in this book are important challenges that any urban practice, education-based activity has to ask. It has to address these things. And I would say that those of us involved in this kind of education are constantly looking at least three things which I find coming through in the book in different ways. The first one, of course, is to look at the question of the educational structures themselves. And these structures that have been established to create generations of, I put, officially recognized planners, for some time, and yet we know that things are not working well in some way or another. The second area I think that the book addresses, directly and indirectly, is the very way that we understand the urban. And the third way, I think, the third area that I think it addresses, which is also so central to our work in the DPU, is the policy planning and design responses to urban development. And that comes through in the very way in which the book addresses the curriculum and the way it's put together. And I think that the book offers responses to all three of these areas. And I just want to go briefly through each of these three areas just to highlight some of the issues which I think are so important. In terms of the education structures, as you could hear from the presentations, the book addresses the deep inequalities in the structures of mainstream educational practice. And I say that across the board globally. I don't just mean in an Indian context. We all struggle with those in different ways, in different contexts. And there's a great deal I can say about this, but I think what you will find in the book is five key areas which Neha has alluded to already. The question of access, of who is the learner. And I think what is so impressive about what's documented here is a very careful, practical, deeply ethical approach to engaging with a wide diversity of learners, and also to following the whole learning trajectory through to a post-IIHS experience. And I think that's just so impressive from what you find here. The second area is the question of pedagogy itself, and you could hear from the presentation. I think what is so fascinating is this deep exploration of a democratic and inclusive learning practice, which is central to everything that's in here. The third area which is something we've all struggled with in our educational institutions, is this question of how we integrate teaching, research, and practice. And in a practice-based course, you just have to do it. But we all know it's not easy because of the structures that drive each of those activities. The funding structures, the institutional structures, even the structures of recognition in our different institutions. And I think IIHS and what the book shows is a very particular way of dealing with that integration. I think what's also obviously so important to all of us is the growing of a faculty that is conscious of these issues. That's the thing. It's a faculty that is conscious of the biases of their own education and who can respond to the transformative agenda that is set out here. And we know that's a journey. That's not something that just happens. It's a journey that is here. And the book documents some of that journey. And I think for me that's always been such an impressive part of my experience with IIHS. And then finally, of course, there's the nitty-gritty of the curriculum itself. I think that it's in this context that I want to talk about the other two challenges rather than get into the detail. So basic to the curriculum, of course, is how the urban is understood from the very get-go, right? And I think that IIHS experience challenges this a sort of more behavioral, a demographic and spatial understanding of the urban. It recognizes the urban as an expression of capitalist development at particular moments of that development process, including driving deep inequalities in that process in contemporary times. And for me, what's so important in that, because that's something we deal with all the time, is a recognition that in that process, this continuum of formal and informal activities that happen in a city. And as we know, the kind of understandings that have been promoted previously is often to give the formal a lower value than the formal, and I think in so doing has deprived us of proper understandings of how the urban actually works. So, as you can see from what has been presented, obviously this engages with a much deeper and interdisciplinary understanding of the urban. And I'm not going to say much more than that because you talked quite a bit about that. But I did want to say that the book reflects the IIHS's approach to turn debates about urban development as a problem on its head and really starts to develop the notion of the urban opportunity. And I use, Aro, your terms, which Aro and a team of people developed to actually promote the urban SDG at a time when when we were trying to argue for the global recognition of urban development as an important part of the SDG process. And I think that notion of the urban opportunity doesn't diminish an understanding of all the problems, but it sets you in a different frame to look the way you understand the urban. So I think this is a really important dimension of what the book speaks to that all the time in lots of different ways. The final area was the whole question of how the curriculum deals with and how policy, planning and design responses to urban development are reflected here. And I think it's clear that the book challenges mainstream interventions in many different ways. The interventions which are riven with the vestiges of colonial inheritance of planning and policy making, and the imposition, of course, of traveling ideas about policy making and planning, which are pushed by a very powerful development industry which operates around for all of us in different ways. And I think that what we see is, I think, three kind of main, what are important shifts for me, which certainly the DPU tries to address, and I see the same issues out of our debates and discussions coming through here. The first is one that Neha talked to a lot, which is the shift from planned intervention as a placeless kind of activity to something that is really context specific, starting from context. One that, as you said, thinks from the South. And of course that in itself we could spend a whole session on, just talking about what that might mean. I think it also shows a shift from a very traditional procedural approach to policy making and planning, with what I think are very limited theorization and understandings of social change, to one that is propositional in character, and that actually looks at those propositions within the context of intersecting power relations that act on the urban context in a wider theory of change. And IIHS has a wider theory of change which is coming through and kind of permeates a lot of the positions that come through in the way this particular Urban Fellows program is put together. And finally, of course, what we see here is a shift from traditional assumptions about planning expertise and who is the planner, to centering of the co-production of knowledge, not just working with urban residents, but actually recognizing them as city makers themselves, and active with their own knowledge. And as you know, in the DPU we share all these challenges, and I think that this book is really a wonderful contribution to all of us in the field who are committed to a more transformative urban practice. So I'd like to say thank you so much.
Thank you, Caren. Thanks. That was very enlightening, wonderful words. Are you going to use that? Or are you going to speak over?
Thank you very much. So it's really an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be speaking at such an event. It's a pleasure to see the book come out. I don't have it in my hand, but it is there. It is beautiful. It's in my bag. Actually, I left it in the room because it's a hefty book. It's hefty because it represents so much work, so much dedication, so much learning, so many innovative practices, and let alone beautiful photos and memories. I really enjoyed looking at those. And it's a privilege also on a personal level, because I have learned so much from your experimentation, your way of thinking, your ways of disrupting planning education. And I've learned a lot also from the DPU, and I'm so thankful to have the two together. But I think it's also a privilege on a collective level, because I believe that the book and the IIHS experience plays an essential role of keeping us, the academia, on our toes. And I mean that in the best possible ways. And I'm going to contextualize this assertion. So you talk a lot about urban transitions, right? Or dare I say actually just urban transition. I noticed that you didn't put your foot in the waters of how you define this urban transitions. We tend to do that in a much more forceful fashion in the DPU. Maybe we should be more careful and more in the way we say that. But talking about urban transitions or thinking about how to shape them, it's a massive challenge in India and elsewhere, of course, and in the face of growing inequalities, climate emergencies, global pandemics, what else can we say, biodiversity loss, digital revolution, growing populism, authoritarianism, etc. And in this fast-changing context, we need actionable knowledge, right? That helps us better understand what is going on and hopefully better see the ways in which we can try and intervene in this transition. And of course, historically, the university has been the privileged place for doing this. And it's been privileged in this knowledge space to a large degree because of its perceived publicness. Publicness because it's shaping future practitioners, publicness because it is, in principle, developing research that is public for the public good, and also because it is helping to shape public citizens in a way, one hopes so. And yet, of course, that publicness of the university has been challenged of yet by those who are arguing rightly that actually the university is maybe aloof from day-to-day challenges, from conflictual realities, or that the university has been inserted by liberalism mechanisms, or also the influence of political parties or political regimes. And so this sort of notion of the university as a public actor is rightly contested. And I think the role that you're playing here is really to show what it means to reclaim that public role and to do it in an extremely concerted and carefully curated way, and that seeps in through a lot of different processes. And I'm going to focus on three, which I think are central to what should be indeed the public role of your university. And I'm going to go quite quickly because they have been obviously discussed by you and picked up very beautifully also by Caren. So one of them is on the education front, and I think what's striking for all of us, possibly because we are confronted with this challenge at UCL right now, is this notion of the careful curation of your student body and your focus on student diversification with a lot of attention to admission procedures, etc. With a focus on diversity of disciplines, of social economic contexts, of geographies, big cities, small cities. I think this is really, we have so much to learn from that. And I understand your worry about scale. This is something that I think we are struggling with a lot at UCL. And I don't think that the mechanism that we have in place with regards to EDI in particular, so EDI is equality, diversity, and inclusion processes, are at all really up to the challenge that we have. And we've been talking a little bit about the centralization process that makes that much harder. So here you really are challenging us to rethink that and to prioritize the importance of this student diversification. Also, your focus on curriculum, and I'm not going to go too much on it because a lot has been said, but the interdisciplinarity which is inbuilt in it, the focus on the multiplicity of knowledges that you bring into the curriculum, and I think really crucial is the recognition that you give to these different knowledges, which again I think many university institutions globally struggle with this recognition. We still have a very hierarchical sense of what knowledge counts. I think also for me was very interesting your conversation on the geographic anchorage of that knowledge. You talk about it being very situated in India, and you rightly emphasize the need to sort of shift from a curriculum that is imported from elsewhere and often from a different era. I think actually you're underplaying the fact that you really are developing a global, what I would call a global curriculum, right? Extremely anchored in its locality, but very much attentive to how it intersects with these global processes of change, of urban change, but also, of course, of ways of thinking in the city. So, again, we have so much to learn and to keep engaging with you on these issues. And of course, a curriculum which is steeped in practice. So the and which relates to this notion of pedagogy, which is primarily built around the practica. So I won't say too much about that because Caren has again picked it up. I think again what I find interesting and how it provokes us is the way in which it challenges who the faculty is entitled to be. In order to have this really provoking pedagogy and curriculum. And I think it really gets us to think about who not only who is recognized as a legitimate teacher, if you want, but also what are the mechanisms of promotion in a faculty and things like that. So I think there's some interesting, I'm thinking about UCL here, obviously. I think there's some interesting processes here, but I think we still have quite a way to go. And again, your experience is incredibly challenging. Closely related, so I'm going to go into the research quickly before going into this public role. And again, I think you do such a beautiful job of curating and thinking in a connected way around the way in which pedagogy, education, research, and public engagement intersect. So I think the attentiveness to the so what of research and theory is again striking with IIHS. I think you said that it was almost by default and by design. Again, I think you're completely underselling yourselves, because of course you are bringing into your teaching the research that you've done, but you would always have done that anyway, and you do that in a way that is amazing because you keep theory being relevant, socially relevant, and constantly changing it. But also I think the ways in which maybe you didn't have so much time to present, but we discussed early on in the workshop, is the way in which you make theory useful for practice because of the ways in which you're asking the questions, but also because it is enabling to shift practices by reframing the ways in which practices have done, by reframing the way questions are put together, and I think also by putting this sort of this word of hope in quite dark times. So the role in which so for me this is really very much a public way of thinking about research. And then finally, this public role in terms of the public engagement, seeing the university as an actor in the city, an actor that's fit for purpose, and you do that you've mentioned it in terms of shaping future practitioners who have a desire to act in the city, whether it's in public or private or non-profit or whichever hybrid ways. But also I think that the university's role in shaping debates, but also in facilitating debates. Again, in the workshop we had before and in the book you mentioned some examples around the role that university plays as a mediator or as a facilitator of conversations. So again, I think this is a really very striking way in which the IIHS provokes us to take on this role with aplomb. And in fact, I'm not going to go into the details, but there's a lot of very concrete ways in which you do that, which I think we need to bring into, we need to reflect on. So to close, I just want to sort of re-emphasize the importance of this book, not just for IIHS, because it captures an extraordinary experiment, but for all of us, certainly for UCL, because of the way it helps us to sharpen and refocus on this public role. And what is important is, you talk about it when you talk about the sort of the genealogy of how you build the IIHS, but I think it's something which is important to continue moving forward, is that this reflection needs to be done locally, of course, but collectively, internationally, because urban challenges are global, so both global and local in nature, because we operate in a world of circulating discourses and practices, yet having to be attentive to the particulars of place, as Caren said so nicely too. And also, I think, because of the unequal political economy of accessing and producing knowledge, within which we operate, and which really requires unsettling. And for that, we need alliances. We need support, and we need inspiration from each other. So thank you so much for the inspiration and the support. And I look forward to many more years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Since we're running out of we've got another 15 minutes or so. I think I'll open it up to the floor for questions or comments from anybody, and then give Neha and Aro a chance to sort of respond and comment. So, any questions? I've got questions as always. I had about 25 today, and I was only allowed 2, so I'm just summarizing. Any questions or comments from anybody? We've got, old friends, new friends in the room, all with masses of experience of teaching and practice. So anybody wants to dip their toes? Not behind my question. Okay, so Aro, you make up an interesting reflection in your foreword about China. And clearly China is not only a neighbor of India, but has gone through a very fast and very different transition. Urbanization transition and economic transition, but with a very different governance. And we have, sadly, Li Yin is not here with us, but we had earlier, I organized a discussion between Li Yin and Fu Longwu, who's in the, in the Bartlett faculty as well, but in Bartlett School of Planning. Asking them to reflect on 50 years of their experience, both as Chinese citizens living abroad, as professionals and as scholars, but also, the 50 years that has seen China change. And it was fascinating. There's a recording, not a fantastic quality recording, but it's up there in the DPU website somewhere. But clearly you've got, and you are a scholar of China as well, and you've looked at China, and you've visited China for many years. Can you reflect on that? I mean, you've got, I'm not going to read what you've written here, but that reflection of how the two systems, two mega countries, now India is bigger than in population terms than China, but they're pretty much the same. What are the implications for training, for teaching, for research? And, is there any attempt to sort of exchange ideas with Chinese colleagues around this?
Yeah, I mean, I wish we had the, sorry, Caren, yeah, I'll stand up there. Thank you. Very interesting question.
Is it worth, can you hear at the back, Michael? Can you hear well? Or should we use one of these?
No, I can speak up. It's not a particular problem.
It's okay.
All of us are used to talking to large classrooms. So, the China question is a very interesting one, and something that I've been engaged with Chinese colleagues for a long period of time. So, they've gone through the largest urbanization in history. I mean, and we had no idea it was going to happen. If you remember Habitat 2 in Istanbul, one of the blind spots of the entire UN system was nobody saw, this is 96, nobody saw Chinese urbanization happening. And Chinese urbanization has not only transformed China, but the world. Because what we're seeing today in terms of the geopolitics, the geoeconomics, comes from Deng Xiaoping's, attempt to transform China, its economy, its manufacturing system, etc., etc., etc. So that was a big shift that took place. But it is very different, and in my own debate with Chinese colleagues, of course, is they are committed at the moment, unfortunately, I think, to hyper-urbanization, and that's a challenge. Because the beauty of China, as it was, or still in some senses is that it had a very diverse urban system. Those of us who've traveled and seen stuff, from rural China and an urban system that's been stable for 1,000, sometimes 1,500 years if you go to the Pearl River Delta, which dealt with a lot of the questions we're trying to deal with today, as Barbara was saying. Biodiversity, the climate crisis, all of the integration was there in those systems because they had learned how to cope with their environments and their populations, which were very dense, pre-industrial at some point of time. That is kind of gone out of the... Just if you go to remarkable Chinese cities which were situated and worked off the water, like in some cases UK was, they've been completely inverted because the roads have turned them away, and now of course we have phenomenal infrastructure in China. So I think the challenge that they have is that they've lost their way in some senses in terms, Chinese planning just now and a lot of economic development is about these regions of hundreds of millions of people. So that balance, which I think is going to be central for the 21st century, fine? You have to provide food, you have to provide ecosystem services, you have to deal with structural inequality, and you cannot deal with that by having, mega cities all over the place. It's important and useful, but it's a serious risk. And I think this is ironic because I think one of the, having talked to people in, the State Council and stuff like that, one of the messages that they took from, let's say, the transition of the collapse of the Soviet Union was the importance of maintaining a peasant culture that could provide food, fine? I mean, Ukraine in some senses and Kazakhstan and the collectivization of the 1930s there actually led to the serious problems during perestroika in the Soviet Union. I know a few people who were involved in that process, and they just were unable in a downturn in the global commodity cycle to be able to deal with their food production. So China was very conscious of that, but in spite of that, I think they might be undoing 2,500 years of agricultural systems and the entire thing. So that's a big risk to them, and hence it's a big risk to the rest of us.
To the world.
Yeah, because China itself, if you look at the core part of China, is a relatively small territory surrounded by the sea on one side and 2 or 3 big deserts. So for them to be able to maintain a population of 1.5 billion, 1.4 billion people aging without having the core services that are critical, and I think it's also a lost opportunity because the 21st century is also going to be about decentralized infrastructure and stuff that's in the landscape. Renewable energy is in the landscape. Managing water is in the landscape. Managing soil is in the landscape. And digital technologies give us the ability to be able to draw that and do different things in the landscape. So decentralization, I think, is the order of the 21st century. That's what renewables and this process is all about. So if you over-centralize, you're being driven by fossil energy, fossil water. And I think that is, it may be a mistake, but it's certainly a travesty on 3,000 years of Chinese history in some senses. So I think that's where they're in a problem. India, on the other hand, still has this opportunity. We're not completely done. We still have, this entire system that can be dealt with, that can deal with this kind of stuff. But for that, we have to keep the balance between so-called rural India and the imaginations that are there and the rest of what's happening. That entire system needs to be balanced out. So I think that's one core reflection. If you over-centralize, you're building fragile systems. And we know that cities do great things, but they also concentrate poverty, inequality, and risk. And if you're doing that at mega scale, wow, you're really, you're putting a civilization at risk in some senses. So I think that's something that we kind of need to reflect on. And I think because they were very enamored by North American forms of development for a long period of time, even though if you go to China, you see, North American forms of development with Chinese characteristics. So you'll have whatever it is. That's a challenge. There were probably too many engineers in some parts.
There was a bit of news 2 weeks ago, which read all over the world, except my brother-in-law sent it for me from Colombia. I don't know how he found it, but it was in the BBC. Here in UCL, a group of archaeologists led by a Chinese professor here found 4,000, 5,000, Michael Wood, Edward, maybe you remember that bit of news? 5,000 or 6,000 year old water supply system in China. But what they emphasized, or at least the journalists chose to emphasize about this, was decentralized. And actually it was very interesting because it resonates with what you're saying now. I don't know whether it's a political position in relation to veiled criticism or not so veiled of the present system and the trends, but they were saying this is how it worked, and it's quite an interesting thing.
Well, and also I always think of the tanks in Bangalore.
Yeah.
I mean, where IIHS is located, it's the same kind of history of, forgetting a historical legacy of an extraordinary infrastructure that managed water that was completely destroyed.
Yes.
Yeah. So we had the mix of Cornwallis and the Duke of Wellington. That's what happened to Bangalore. I mean, Cornwallis, he do the crossroads, he lost America, and then he came and he did some exciting things, and that entire system fell apart because they forgot the context in which he was working, and we're trying to kind of rebuild some of that. But it's very difficult to rebuild. I mean, he's one of the experts of flood and water systems in India. It's really tough to build something unless you're able to rebuild the culture, because the institutions, if they don't exist, all the technical knowledge won't help you, fine.
Yes.
Because it has to be embedded in the population, in practices and institutions. So it's tough to do. Yeah.
Are people sort of tired? Is it Friday? We've all had long weeks.
Yes.
Very long week. I've had a very long week, very long day. I'm happy to call it a day. But if there's anybody dying to make a comment? No? Okay. We'll let it end there.
Keeping them from their weekends.
I'm from the supper. Ado, thank you very much. Neha, thank you so very much. Again, as Caren said, I mean, both Barbara and Caren were much more eloquent than me in thanking you and about this long long friendship and collaboration, and may it last
Mm.
for many more years. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.